Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first video of BIM Careers. This is the first podcast and I'm here with Matthew Joseph. Hi Matthew.
Hi Tarek.
So today we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion in the workplace, in the AEC and in BIM industry specifically. And the first thing that I want to discuss with Matthew is who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, who am I? Such a question.
Yes.
So my name is Matthew Joseph. I am a British trained architect and I currently live in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
I've only been in Vancouver for about 2.5 years now, and I am also a specialist with Revit and BIM. Throughout my training I've tried to keep at the forefront of things happening in the AEC industry.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was in the UK, there was a big run-up for BIM adoption for all government-based projects. This was in the run-up to 2016, and that's where I had most of my specialist training and development. So at the minute I am in Vancouver and working for a large commercial firm, and I'm currently also a representative on the diversity committee there too.
Nice, that's great. So it's very fitting we're going to discuss diversity and inclusion today. We'll go through the different things that we want to discuss. The first thing that I want to discuss with you is what is diversity and inclusion? So can you define these terms? Because I think different people have different, understanding or
Sure.
definitions of these terms.
Sure, so I mean, it's such a blanket coverage to define it under one single value, but a lot of it can be subjective to the individual. So diversity is part and parcel of being inclusive for everybody. Diversity is the action of individuals and companies and initiatives, and then inclusion is the feeling that the person has towards that diversity. So the diversity and inclusion are part and part of the same thing. Diversity to me is basically being all-inclusive and varied. So it's not just focused on one single aspect, it's a coverage of all aspects together.
I see. That's nice. I personally agree with that definition, and I know that in Canada we're a very diverse country. There's a lot of people with different ethnicities. We all identify as Canadian, but a lot of people come from different backgrounds. So that's definitely very pertinent in this country. Part of the diversity and inclusion topics that I want to discuss is cultural awareness. So a lot of people have different cultures, and what is cultural awareness and what can we do to sort of promote cultural awareness in the workplace and in the AEC and BIM industry specifically?
Of course, yeah. So cultural awareness, I guess, is, again, it's kind of subjective in terms of everyone has a different cultural knowledge, and it's not necessarily the knowledge, it's not necessarily the positive knowledge of a certain culture. So for example, it could be a negative aspect of a culture, but cultural awareness is basically understanding all different cultures, whether it's positive or negative. So within the AEC industry, it's having an awareness for the built environment and how that affects people, and that's basically what it is. The culture can be defined as either a certain demographic group, or it can be defined as a certain area in terms of the natural environment as well. So there's an awareness for cultural of the people, and then cultural of the people together as an environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you consider yourself culturally aware of other people that you work with or you worked with in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I've come from London before I moved to Vancouver, so that was a that's one of the world's global cities, and you kind of had no choice, you know. So you're always dealing with multiple different cultures, and everyone's final destination seems to be in London. At the time when I was there was people from all corners of the globe, and it's a similar situation here in Vancouver. You come to Vancouver and there's cultures from all over the world. The firm I currently work for has multiple cultures, both domestic and internationally. So it's definitely something that you see in your surroundings.
Yeah, that's great. Well, speaking of London, we're drinking some tea, so we could do a quick cheers. Cheers to London and to coming to Canada.
Yeah, cheers.
Cheers. Okay, so we talked about cultural awareness. The next thing I want to talk with you, Matthew, is religious awareness. I know religion and politics could be touchy subjects.
Yeah.
Without getting into the weeds or talking too much in details or taking positions even, how can you promote religious awareness, and what is religious awareness as well?
Well, just in general, there's multiple different religions and multiple sectors of different religions. So it's a very broad topic, and to be aware of all of those things is almost impossible.
Mm-hmm.
But to be, I guess, understanding that there could be differences, that's the critical path that anyone should take when it comes to religious awareness. And also on the different note, you don't want to be dismissive of anyone's views and following. So basically, that's the way to be aware of different religious groups and different religious practices as well. And the other thing is, it's not at face value. It's not necessarily this person looks a certain way, so they must be of this religious group. It's always subjective on the person, and it's always an individual aspect. So someone could identify as one thing, and the person standing next to them could also identify as the same thing, but they could still be different. So it's definitely something to bear in mind that each person, even though they could have a single blanket coverage with regards to their religion, they're still individual people, and they could still take what they want from that certain religion. So that's about being aware of the differences between the different religious groups, and then also between the different people.
That's interesting. In your experience, did you have any issues, let's say, or see any issues with religious awareness in the past where some people felt like they were not treated the same because of their religion, or there was any kind of disparity on any level because of religion?
I think for me personally, I grew up with a lot of Rastafarian people within my neighborhood, and so they did get discriminated against because of the way that they looked, the way that they dressed was different to the majority. So a lot of times they would have dreadlocks, and they would have an accent, and so instantly they were discriminated against, and they're discriminated against for their beliefs and for doing things in a way in which they think is the right way to do things. So I think it was a bit unfair on the majority to discriminate against them for being in a minority group. So I did see that happening, and that's sort of a global thing. It doesn't matter where you are, you always get that sort of, if you're a minority group, you're always going to be discriminated against from the majority group. It's human nature.
That's interesting. With religion, I mean, it's more visual in a sense, because a lot of times, if you try to find out what or try to figure out what the person's background is or whatever, you can't really tell 100%. But with religion, it's more obvious. Someone's wearing a cross, you know they're Christian, or hijab or whatnot. So it's kind of more touchy in a sense. We'll talk about a bit later what are the avenues, or what is the path basically to improve such awareness and to collaborate together as well without such bias and whatnot.
Exactly.
Speaking of which, talking about bias, you heard of unconscious bias, right?
Yeah, unconscious bias is basically being biased against someone without even knowing that you're being biased against someone. It could be your verbal actions, or it could be your physical actions. So yeah, unconscious bias is definitely a issue, and it's probably one of the biggest issues that any minority group would face.
Sure. How do you know if someone is facing unconscious bias? Because some people might be and they don't know.
Yeah.
Some people might not be and they think they are.
Yeah, that's a good question, because a lot of people are experiencing unconscious bias and they don't even know. I'm trained as an architect, but I do understand certain things, and I'm not a professional by no means with regards to unconscious bias, and I think that it does take a little bit of foresight to envision yourself experiencing it, and in particular, looking at someone else experiencing unconscious bias is also a unique skill set as well. I think there are certain individuals, like psychologists, that are definitely trained to look at unconscious bias, and there's a lot of resources out there, so people can take surveys, for example, and they can discover, oh, I'm actually suffering from unconscious bias, and they didn't even know. So I think it's definitely a thing which is definitely out there, and people experience it in so many different ways that they might not even know that they're experiencing it. And if they have any doubt, they should definitely check and see if they do have this unconscious bias against them.
I see. Now, the opposite, if you want, or the other side of unconscious bias is conscious bias, what is otherwise known as racism, if you want.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little about that? What is racism, and in what ways does it demonstrate itself, let's say, in the AEC and BIM industry?
Yeah, so I guess that is one of the sort of first biases against people, because it's such a face value thing to have. If someone else looks different to you, that's the first thing that you can instantly discriminate against. So if someone has a different skin tone, they dress differently, they walk differently, they act slightly differently. You can see that without even having a physical one-to-one interaction with them before they even start talking. There's always that inherent bias. If someone's grown up in a homogenous society where everyone looks like them, and then all of a sudden they see someone who looks differently, it goes back to that unconscious bias as well. So that's kind of the sort of the keys that lead you into this situation where you got this racism which happens. Largely, I want to say it's unconscious, but a lot of times it is conscious, because just because they're different to you, it doesn't mean that they should be discriminated against.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, we have that in the AEC industry.
Yeah. In your opinion, do you think, I mean, I know you worked in the UK and you're working now in Canada. In general, do you think that there is more racism based on your experience strictly in Europe or more in Canada? And what is the let's say the impression that you got basically from certain cases? Without also getting too personal, did you personally experience racism at any point in your life, professionally? I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely experienced it, and I think there is a little bit of sort of ignorance there too. Just because I came from an inner city neighborhood, a ghetto or an urban slum, which is more deprived to certain neighborhoods, you experience it just by sending in your CV, your resume, and it has your postal code on there. So you experience negativity from job offers and stuff like that, and rejections in straight away without even attending an interview. And then you get to an interview and you always got a sort of set of eyes hovering over you. So I have experienced that throughout my career within the AEC industry.
Yeah.
The UK is probably about the same as the environment here in Canada, except The only difference is it's more in your face because the UK has twice as many people in such a small place, so it's more condensed. And like I use the analogy that the UK is like Canada on steroids. It's like twice as many people all put into the same location, and it's twice as bad in certain aspects, but it could also be twice as good. So there's pros and cons to kind of living in both locations. I think with regards to the experiences, it's probably still a little bit earlier here for me living in Canada, only 2.5 years. I think I've still got time to assess it.
Yeah, I understand. I'm asking actually out of interest. I personally didn't work internationally, let's say in Asia or Europe or Africa or South America. That's why it's very interesting to know somebody that worked in different places. What is your outlook and what is your impression of, such a touchy topic such as racism? Moving on, let's talk about equity. So equity distinguishes itself or presents itself in different ways. Let's talk specifically about gender equity. Do you think that there is parity between the genders, again, overall in the AEC and BIM industry? And if not, why is there no equity?
Equity for the genders is it's kind of a touchy topic in terms of our industry, because the industry was only limited to men historically. So basically, you only had men running the show, and women did not do this as a career, as an industry. So the guys at the top of the food chain, so to speak, they're always going to be this certain demographic. They're always going to be the white collar male, and they're always going to be considered that way, both within the industry and outside of the industry. So it's very, very difficult for equity to be there for women who want to be at the same level as men if those outside of the industry also see a architect as a white man, a European man.
So one question that I had regarding gender equity is, do you think there's more gender equity in Europe or in North America?
I think there's more people in Europe, so there's definitely advantages there. I think there's I think the fight for equity has been greater in Europe. Well, maybe not greater, but definitely for a longer period of time. Historically, Europe has the suffragettes, so they've always fought for equity, and that gave rise to laws that were enacted for equity reasons. I think North America, being the new world and basically developed by men, there's certain things which hasn't quite gained momentum, and especially how the different states and provinces are separated with regards to their laws and regulations. It's not the same in Europe. Europe has a lot more blanket coverage, whereas you could be defined by the EU when the UK wasn't the EU. And so, for instance, there will be an EU law, which a lot of EU laws came about to improve working conditions and equity and diversity, anti-racism and discrimination laws and stuff like that. So that covered the whole of the EU zone, and so that's definitely a good thing. Whereas in North America, I have not seen that yet, and it seems to be slow to partake that sort of thing across all 50 states and all the provinces and territories. So that's one different aspect on things.
I see. What about visible minorities? Let's talk about equity with visible minorities. Do you think there is equity in general as well? Or if you compare, let's say, the UK and North America, do you think there's more equity there or here?
I think there's more equity. Overall, I think there would be more equity here in North America. If you include the States, the US has the biggest, in the example of the African American population, it has the biggest
per capita
African diasporan population outside of Africa. So basically, the US has that population to do diverse initiatives. And then also they do have some cities, especially if you look in the south, which have a high black population, for example, and that just doesn't exist in Europe. Europe is more, I want to say, mixed in Western Europe, and so we don't have a strong minority population condensed into a whole entire city, so it's very difficult to compare them. I think overall, Europe is slightly ahead, like I said about the blanket coverage with regards to regulations and diversity and stuff, but in North America there's more pockets of dominance within certain demographic groups.
Okay, so if you talk about equity in terms of disability, so what is a way that manifests itself at the workplace and the AEC and BIM industries? We talk about physical mobility, we talk about being mentally challenged or having a certain type of disorder. Did you personally experience, let's say, working with someone that had a certain type of disability?
Yeah, I've worked with people who have been disabled and are currently in a wheelchair. So to use the antiquated term, it would be handicapped. They don't usually use that anymore in Europe as they consider it a form of bias and discrimination. Mm-hmm. I still see it used here in North America, but that's another topic. I think the AEC industry as a whole is still behind other industries with regards to allowing those individuals who have a disability to be sort of client-facing and at the forefront of AEC. They might have them within the office, but they might not necessarily be a principal of an office, a partner in charge, or someone who's client-facing, like a project manager and stuff like that. And I somewhat get it with regards to certain things you need to do. You can't physically do them, especially if you look at the C in AEC, it's construction, so you need to have the physical ability. I think there's definitely a bias against them, and a lot of it can't be helped, but it doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement, and yes. I see there's a lot of room for improvement with regards to it.
Let's say someone is deaf or mute or blind, in what ways basically can they integrate into the BIM industry or the AEC teams? One example I can think of, for example, somebody that works on, let's say, content creation or validation and whatnot, especially in today's world with the whole digital revolution that's happening. You don't need to be sitting face to face necessarily, and a lot of times, people use chat a lot and they use emails a lot. So that definitely alleviates. Can you speak a bit to that, how technology can help people with disability?
Yeah.
Perhaps.
So I guess the non-physical disabilities come in a varied range of different disabilities, and basically all of them are as capable as people who don't have any disabilities. And I think there's this kind of misconception with regards to people being inadequate just because they have this disability. One of the biggest sort of what they consider a disability is dyslexia within architecture. There's several architects, global famous superstar architects who are dyslexic.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that they're unable to do the actual job. And I think there's definitely a room for all sorts of disabilities, whether physical or like a mental disability. And I think the industry definitely needs to do more to welcome those people and more to hold on to these people and accept them based on the end product rather than reading them as face value people. And if they can deliver the same as what a non-disabled person can deliver, then I think they should be treated all the same.
All the same,
yeah.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that. Let's go back to the top and talk about what can we do to make things better. So all the topics that we discussed, including cultural awareness, religious awareness, racism, and equity. Let's start with the first one, which is cultural awareness. what can we do to raise cultural awareness in the AEC and BIM industry?
Yeah, I think that's a good topic. I think there should be initiatives where people can self-educate with regards to different cultures. I think there's not enough time given outside of just doing a 9 to 5, pay the bills, just produce the work, for self-development. I think there's a lot of employees who are just there for the money, which, yeah, that's fine. But I think they need to, at a firm level, at a company level, they need to introduce more cultural events and more schemes where they're able to learn about the different cultures, especially if you're working within that cultural or demographic group. You need to know about that culture, and I think there needs to be extras given to the employees.
Can you give an example of such an event? So what do you have in mind for cultural, what kind of event can you do to raise cultural awareness at the workplace?
Well, I think there's multiple things, but one thing that stands out to me is food. Food is assigned to cultures quite drastically, and it's very varied. For example, my family is from the Caribbean, so we
nice.
Jamaica to be specifically. So we like lots of hot and spicy grilled meats, for example. So one classic dish will be the jerk chicken. To be culturally aware, I'll have to put the sauce on the side because I know that I like my sauce really, really hot, and not everyone's gonna be able to take that. So cooking will definitely be a way to kind of invite people to discover cultures, and cooking, barbecues, sort of family-oriented events. I think that's definitely one of the things that you could do to open up that cultural awareness.
That's cool. That's a great idea. I think I worked in companies before where food was it brings people together. It's there's no debate about food. No one comes and says, "Oh, what is this?"
Yeah.
People disagree about design. They disagree about construction, about all kinds of things, politics, religion, etc. But no one disagrees with food.
Yeah.
If you feed people, everyone's happy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's talk about religious awareness. So what can the AEC and the BIM industries do to raise religious awareness?
I think that's a very similar topic. You've got to see whichever religious group you're going to be working with. All religious groups, as far as I know, they're accepting of showing people their religion. So if you're going to work on a Muslim mosque, for example, then go and see the Islamic architecture in the Middle East, or go and see a mosque. Reach out to the imam at the mosque and go and visit, and then let them tell you and inform you of what their community is about and what their religion is about. That would help you with your design. And I think that's definitely a pro for anyone in the AEC industry who wants to improve on their religious awareness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you, speaking of that, one thing that I wanted to ask you, are you in favor of, let's say, celebrating certain religious events? Or do you think it's a good idea for firms to celebrate, such as Christmas, Ramadan, Hanukkah, etc.?
Yeah, I think there's definitely pros to it. I think the celebration will be a touchy subject because you don't want to ruffle any feathers, but definitely observation of all the different events, regardless of what they are. You could have a Chinese New Year, you could have a Iranian New Year, you could have a Christian New Year, you could have a Eastern Orthodox New Year. So there's lots of different things. That's just New Year, let alone all the different demographics of the different cultures and religions that are out there. So I think definitely observe it. You don't have to necessarily celebrate it, but the observation is definitely key.
I see. Racism.
Yeah.
What can we do basically to end racism?
End racism.
That's a tough one, right?
That's a lifelong mission of many people. I think there's within the AEC industry we are definitely improving. I don't think we've looked back at how historically minority groups have been discriminated against, and I think we are on a bright course for the future. I think the racism at face value is definitely changing, and I think that's good for the future.
Mm-hmm. Equity, so gender equity. What can the AEC industries do to promote other genders basically from being more present? Right now, I think, as you mentioned, I do agree that it's very male dominated. What can the industries do to promote basically other genders to take more prominence in the industries?
I think they just need to make it a more welcoming environment, and that stems from coming through the education system and the school system, and getting more people knowledgeable about their career paths. If you're a female, it doesn't mean that you can't be a bricklayer, for example. Like, it's all encompassing. So I think that awareness right at the grassroots, right in the schools, in the universities, the colleges, I think that's key to improving the demographics. I think the talent pool as it isn't as varied as it should be, and you have to get them rather young, so they know that there's a clear path that they want to take, and we can enable it. Us that are in the industry, we can enable that clear path for them.
Yeah, I totally agree. Actually, it's if we think about it, it really goes back to the root cause of all that. Basically, one of the reasons why we don't have enough women and people that identify as different genders as well in the industries is because of the education system. It really goes back to that, where people think that this is just a man's job or this is a woman's job. It's these preconceptions that we have regarding gender. Let's talk about minorities. So what can we do to promote basically more? It touches on cultural awareness as well, but also visible and I want to say invisible minorities, but visible minorities and just minorities in general.
Yeah, I think that's the similar situation to the religious groups. I think the sort of white male architect coming from a privileged background is at the forefront of being client facing, and I think that needs to change. I think there needs to be more of the minority workers within the AEC workforce going to be client facing and building up that rapport with the community. Also, that evolves into the schools and the education system and the local residents seeing this person from a minority group and saying, "Oh, I can possibly do that. I can do this thing." So I think there's definitely a case for the AEC industry to be within the communities and working closely with them, and that will drive up the numbers of any minority group. I think that's definitely the key.
I see. Yeah, I totally agree. Last point that we discussed is disability. So what can companies do basically to promote more people with disabilities to work in the AEC and the BIM industries?
I think there's a two-pronged approach. I think the first thing is enabling access to it for all disability groups, whether it's a physical or a mental disability. And the second one is going above and beyond what is regulated. So for instance, if there's a code regulation which means you need to install a ramp for access for anyone in a wheelchair, go above and beyond it. Install an elevator, a platform lift or something like that, or make it decorative, make it welcoming. And I think that's what the key is for having any disability group within the AEC industry. I think once you get them through the door and you keep them there, it's definitely a good invitation for others to come into the industry.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I really think the combination of these different considerations are also very important for design, and we need to take these things into account as well in design, not also
precisely
in the workplace and in the industry itself. Part of it is internal, and part of it is external. And as the saying goes, we are a product of our environment. If we live in a racist environment, it sort of translates or seeps into the design somehow.
Yeah, exactly.
And same thing with disabilities, visible minorities, gender, etc. So it's very important to live in a healthy environment and ecosystem in the industry and at work to reflect these values and these feelings as well into the actual work that we're doing. One thing that I wanted to discuss before we have some final thoughts regarding all these interesting topics is I know you're involved on some initiatives related to diversity and inclusion, so can you tell us very briefly about them?
Yeah, so I'm in touch with several architects who are based in Toronto, and we form a group which specifically looks at racial diversity within the industry.
Mm-hmm.
The first step is to try and gather data, which enable us to seek out initiatives. If we don't know that there's a problem there, there's no way to formulate an initiative. So our first step is to try and gather some data, see where we are, and that sets the baseline for any room for improvement. The second one is more locally. I'm working with some of the student communities at the University of British Columbia, and we're trying to improve and bridge the gap between the education system and the workforce here locally in BC. In addition to that, I would like to set up something which actually bridges the gap between schools and the University of British Columbia. So there's a gap there as well which needs to be filled in, and I think once a lot of these gaps are bridged, the sort of diversity initiatives seek out themselves, connect the dots, and then we start painting the picture.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, best of luck with these initiatives, and we'll definitely hear about them in the near future.
For sure, yeah.
Final thoughts. So perhaps we could end on a certain note. I think living in Canada, we are a very diverse country. I personally lived in the east of Canada. I lived most of my life in Montreal. I worked in Quebec City as well. I also was in Ottawa. So I've seen, a lot of these things are still challenges wherever we are in the world. And I think we're very privileged in Canada to have a certain openness and certain, tolerance and a lot of friendliness towards all these topics. The most important thing, in my opinion, is for it to translate into actual policies and the actual firm stances, in a sense, because those individual firms make up an industry, right?
Exactly,
So
yeah.
it really depends on the behavior of each individual firm for us to have a general picture of the industry and say this industry is heading in this direction or that direction. So what can you recommend, let's say, in the future? Can we end on a certain note that brings hope to all these very difficult topics, racism and unconscious bias, etc. What do you think is where we're heading in the future, and what can we do to make it better overall?
I think we are taking so many baby steps that together the bigger picture creates a good outlook on things. I think we're no longer in like Jim Crow laws or anything like that. We're no longer in apartheid South Africa. Things are changing for the better, and I think the more baby steps we take, it creates one bigger step for a better working environment within the AEC industry. I think it's not just the AEC industry, but there's definitely steps that we're taking right now and making actionable commitments to things, and that's definitely formulating the industry to be going into the right direction. I think that's definitely one of the things that we're doing right now.
That's excellent. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Matthew Joseph, thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you.
And stay tuned for the next episode as well. We'll talk about some very interesting topics. I'll catch you guys sometime soon with another interesting episode of BIM Careers. Have a great day. Thanks again, Matthew.
Thank you.